As you may recall, we are working through some of the faith stories, and our leadership team has so graciously said yes to sharing their story, cracking their heart. So today we're hearing from Gary. So Gary, I want to thank you for being willing to share. I know that it's an intimidating bunch out there. That's a
Well, it is an intimidating bunch at times, and especially times when you sort of bare your soul a bit.
yeah.
So it's not an easy thing, but it's something I think is important, and I'm glad to have the opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, just to rewind to say, God's story necessarily plays out in the lives of people, right? When we read of real people in here, I saw an article this week that Simon of Cyrene, they found an ossuary that they think is related to him, and it could be him. And so we think that sometimes these are just random people, but these are actually people of history that walked on this earth, and the story of God played out in their lives in a similar way that it's playing out in ours. And so that's why it's important to kind of share this. So again, thank you so much for being willing to go through the meat grinder of this experience. We thank you. So just to kind of give us some context, how long have you attended PFC?
Well, actually, I had to sit down and think about that because it didn't seem like it's been very long at all, but when one year you add to the next, it turns out that I've been here about 14 years. And before that, for a bit, I attended at Central, specifically because I knew the pastor there. He was a friend and a colleague and a chaplain with the police service. And I appreciated him as a man, and I attended at Central with him for a while. But coming here to Pelham Friends, about 14 years.
Yeah, okay, 14 years, that's amazing. I want to rewind back a little longer than 14 years. Let's go back to just a couple years further. But let's go back to some of your early years growing up. What can you tell us about those years? And what are some of your earliest memories?
Well, when I sat down to think about this, you reflect back to your childhood, obviously, and I was one of seven. I'm the third eldest of seven, 4 boys, 3 girls. I'm the oldest male in the family, the oldest boy. And when I think back to my childhood with mom and dad and my brothers and sisters, I kind of look at it as an idyllic childhood. I mean, I was a country kid. I was born and raised, born in Dunnville, raised in the country. And those were precious times when I think back, because it was safe. There were no sense of harm on the street. We placed ourselves in jeopardy from time to time of our own doing. But with that aside, I mean, Mom and Dad never had to be concerned about safety. At least as far as we were concerned, they didn't have to be concerned. And I was born and raised in a Christian home. Mom and Dad were both very staunch Christian folks. And I remember Jesus and the Bible was always a large part of my childhood. And when I think back to Sundays was what we called dress-up day. Back then, you put on your little suit and tie, or I don't know, I'm not sure if I had a tie, but I mean, it was always dress-up day, and you got your finest on. And we went off to Dunnville to the Free Methodist Church. Now, the Free Methodist Church was a part of our historic family. I don't know what the connection was, but it was the Free Methodist Church. And I remember attending regularly. It was a part of what we were required to do. And as I say, it was dress-up day. And we went off to church, and I remember Grandpa and Grandma Nicholls were a large part of that church, and certainly a large influence on our family. Grandpa Nicholls was and some may recognize this and others won't, but Grandpa Nicholls was a Bernardo boy. And a Bernardo boy was an orphan that they gathered up in London back in the late 1800s, 1900s, and shipped him over to Canada to work on farms. It was, I wouldn't call it slave labor, but it was very little pay for work that they were required to do. But he came over to Canada as a young man, a teenager, I believe. But he came over as what I would define as a Victorian Christian. I have my own interpretation of that. I'm not exactly sure what the actual interpretation is, but he came over as a Victorian Christian in my mind, which was a very, very staunch, there's right and there's wrong. And that was Grandpa Nicholls. And he had a fairly significant sway on our larger family, and Mom and Dad in particular. But that said, again, Mom and Dad were more lenient. I mean, they weren't of that same ilk, but nonetheless, they were influenced by Grandpa in particular, and they had very strict rules about do's and don'ts. But it was all with a Christian background. It was all with a Bible background, and very much a part of my growing up. The church, my involvement with church as a child was, as I say, it was Sunday school, but I can remember Mrs. McCready was the pastor. And Mrs. McCready was an elderly lady at the time, at least in my mind she was, probably in her 40s. But she was a what I would call hellfire and brimstone preacher. And I can remember as a child that those were very scary sermons. But I think, when I think about Grandpa and Grandma, and when I think about Mom and Dad, certainly it was Grandpa's cup of tea. It was the way Grandpa was raised, and that was what he expected the preacher to be, I'm sure. And it was very much in some ways, a scary time. When I think about Mrs. McCready's sermons even today, they were scary services.
Yeah.
But they were influential in the sense that I came through my younger childhood days, teenage years, very much influenced by Christ and Bible teaching.
Yeah, interesting. I think it's even when you think of those early experiences at church, Mrs. McCready and her sermons still will give you the shivers. But I think of when you hearing in your story, and correct me if I'm wrong, your parents being pretty massive influences, and yes, that's a part of it. McCready, your parents in the hellfire, but I served with a pastor once that said more is caught than taught. And so yes, you may have had teaching on the hellfire and brimstone, but how did you know about the love of Christ? Probably by the way your parents interacted with you and how they, set an example. It's just a thought. I'm just trying to think when we have these teachers that bring the hellfire and brimstone, how do we learn that God is a loving God? Maybe I know that's a thought. You didn't have any thought, but
I think to respond to that, I would suggest that beyond the service, beyond the sermon that one might have found at my age scary, and I'm talking about a child, beyond that, there was a loving church family.
Right. Yeah.
There were other kids and our family for sure, and other young people and young children there. So I mean, there was that church family, that loving environment that I can remember days of. Hello.
Yeah.
I can remember days of getting together, Sunday school picnics and those kinds of things. So, I mean, beyond what I would classify as a scary kind of sermon from time to time from the pastor, she was a lovely lady, and I have fond memories of Sunday school events and Sunday school picnics and camaraderie with kids and in the larger church family.
Yeah. Okay, so lots of mixed influences there growing up. And then you mentioned how you grow up with Christ and the Bible being pretty central. So then as you kind of moved through those teenage years and you entered young adulthood, what did Jesus mean for you at that point?
Well, I'm going to suggest that probably not unlike many young men, young boys, there was a time as I grew older and I left home right after high school, and when I say left home, I left home and I went to the States for a couple of years. I remember when we crossed the border at Buffalo, my buddy and I, when we crossed the border at Buffalo, the border agent says, "And where are you off to?" "Oh, we're just going over to Buffalo for lunch." Didn't come back for almost 2 years. But we didn't consider ourselves illegal aliens. We were just a couple of young guys off for an adventure.
Yeah, that's interesting. And then what about career as you kind of, so you went down south, 2 years of illegal alien down there. And then, so this faith foundation, how did that get woven into sort of that experience south of the border? And then the career years after that?
Well, the environment, and like I say, I don't consider myself so much different than a lot of young men, in particular at that age. The influence of Jesus and his love in my life began to wane. I was an adventure. I was off growing up. I was off learning about life. And the influences of my early days was beginning to wane. And I was cognizant of that, but I was busy, and I was returning home, looking now for a career. I had wanted to get into policing. I can remember being a child Parker's age, wanting to be a policeman. Not influenced by anybody in my family, because there was no police background in my family whatsoever. It was just something that I was attracted to for whatever reason. And so, unlike a lot of young people, I didn't have to think about what I was going to do when I grew up. I always knew what I wanted to do when I grew up, and that was to get into policing. So, again, having moved away, having become somewhat distant from my early days of teaching and Jesus' influence in my life, I moved into a career that was, at least for me, was all-consuming. Unfortunately, perhaps to an excess, but I was by nature a perfectionist, and those that work with me will know that. But I was driven to do well, and that busyness again added to my distancing from the influences of the church. I stepped away from church, and for a long time just didn't attend. I was married at the time, and busy with family, busy with a new career, and the influences of church and Bible teachings were slipping away.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I wonder, as those parents, and obviously I know there's always a journey, but as your parents experienced some of that and saw that, if I were pastoring them and they expressed concern with you, I would have just really sort of enforced the rest of the story has not been written, right? You think of those early experiences that you had with them, and I would have just, again, the rest of the story isn't written. So continue to pray, continue to love, and continue to be involved in Gary's life, support through that. Because what's fascinating is obviously, those early years with an orientation to Jesus, and then we have these young adult years and into the career years where other things kind of pop up and get in the way. But you're here now. So if you think of, again, you're oriented to Christ through maybe, again, influence of parents, influence of grandparents, you're a part of church, you have friends at church, hellfire and brimstone, but also love. And then again, you get into years where you think you may know better and you want to live some life, and you go down south, and I'm sure you actually told me some of those stories, which are pretty great. He dodged the draft. Ask him about that sometime. And then you think about, again, coming back and you get into your career and you're doing everything. And if you think about that, again, your orientation point is less about Christ. You've expressed that you're busy with other stuff. So what was the catalyst that sort of reoriented you back to Christ? Because I've known you for a year and a half now, And I know you as a God-fearing, Jesus-loving, you're passionate about the church, you care about faith. So, and you've been here for 14 years. So these friends know your journey. So at some point you've reoriented. So what was the catalyst that kind of caused that reorientation back to Christ?
Well, let me begin by saying that I never let go. There was obviously a time in my life where I was away, but I never let go. It was always something there in the back of your head that says, think about where you are, think about what you're doing. You got to get back. You got to get back to church. You got to get back to Jesus. You got to get back to the church and church family. It was always there, but I buried it in the busyness of life. The influence and the culture of my workplace, oftentimes, as you might well imagine, very negative, and lots of positive, but oftentimes on the street, it can be very negative. So those kinds of influences were powerful, but I never let go entirely. And all the while, I'm married to Margaret, and many of you know Margaret and know her well. She never lost her faith. She always was strong, and she was always a positive influence. And she was not one to press and push, but she encouraged constantly to come back to church, come with the family, come back with me. Margaret was here long before I was, and there was a time that I began to realize, now's the time, my career is probably peaking, and I'm certainly less influenced by a negative culture, because I'm in a place in the service where I'm not influenced by the negativity so much as I'm now influenced by the politics of it all. But she was always there as an encouragement. And so I'm thinking in the probably 2000, I'm not exactly sure of the date, but it was 2004, 2006, someplace in there. We're in Florida. I have read recently a bit about Joyce Myers, and there was some influences through her teachings that I was impressed by. I mean, I don't know, obviously hadn't met the lady, didn't know the lady, but I mean, from readings, I thought she had an impressive background. She had a very interesting story, for those that know her story. And so we happened to be in Florida, and there was
No, you're good, buddy. Just leave.
I don't know what you call them, a rally or whatever she called it, in Orlando. So we went to Orlando. Margaret and I went to Orlando. We both wanted to hear her, and it was that lady had a powerful influence on me that day. I think it was then that I made the decision that we need to get back. I need to get back. I need to get back into the church, back into the church family, back into God's grace. And so that was a beginning, I would say, of my return to Christ. And then I'm back home and I'm reading. When I have a thought, when I have an interest, I research it, I read it, I want to know it. So I began reading, and the Bible reading was always something that I did. And I've read the Bible a couple of times, but I find it difficult at times to read. I was intrigued by our doctor professor that when we had Barker.
Dr. Barker, yeah.
Dr. Barker. I mean, there's so much more to that text than I ever read. And I read it a couple of times, and there's so much more to it. But I'm reading material that I can read and understand. And one of the books that I picked up and read that I thought was extremely interesting for me, Rick Warren's A Purpose-Driven Life. And there having read that book, there was a particular passage in that book that I read that was what I would say the moment. It was an excellent read. And I believe that was the turning point.
Yeah. Oh, that's so yeah, it's so beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. One of the interesting things is we perceive our stories, and so your comment of making the decision to come back under grace, with Joyce Meyer, and the reality though is that you actually never left grace, right? Grace had carried you. Grace was with you, even when you didn't necessarily perceive it. So you think of like the grace when you're on the street as an officer, dealing with some of the worst, the grace when you're wading through the politics, the grace when all the way we, experiencing God's grace. But then, because you're right in your story of the actually acknowledging it, noticing it, tuning into it, and saying, actually, yeah, let's center that again. Just a different way to reframe exactly like kind of what you're saying, because I believe that grace never left you, that even as you were unsure of what, again, just different focuses and all the rest of that, but that's so beautiful. Yeah, and then yes, hearing of how again Joyce Meyer, Rick Warren, it's great when some of these speakers out there, they're arm's length, but that can actually, so many others have also been influenced by some of those similar voices, and so it's just very cool to kind of weave that in together. As we were chatting about this, you had mentioned that you had the opportunity to go to Israel, kind of as this was all, in your 14 years coming back, as things were going. Can you tell us a little bit about Israel?
Yeah, Israel was a trip that Margaret and I always wanted to do. She never got the chance. But soon after her passing, Shannon and I, my daughter, said, let's do Israel. Let's go to Israel. We'll use it as a memory trip. And at that particular point in time, I now know Carolyn. Carolyn's in my life now. But it was a thing that she understood and respected. And so Shannon and I, and some of you know the story because I've shared it with you, but some of you know the story, but it was a trip for Margaret. And it was, in hindsight, it's probably the most revealing trip abroad I've ever taken. I've traveled a lot in North America, a bit overseas, but this one was a special trip in so many ways. But beyond the memory, beyond the time we spent thinking about Margaret and her wishes to go, we were traveling with a Christian group. It was a Christian group out of the States, but we were traveling with a Christian group, and there was a pastor that was a part of our group, and he was a fine gentleman and a very learned individual, as was the Jewish Christian tour guide. But the pastor was a very interesting man and a very influential man, I think, in his own circles because he had some folks with him from his church. But we had an opportunity for those that felt they wanted they wanted to be baptized while they were on this trip. And so Shannon and I talked about that, and we said, well, this is our opportunity to demonstrate our love of Jesus, our belief. And what better place to demonstrate that than here in Israel, of all places. What an opportunity. But I can tell you that the pastor that was with us, he wasn't about to allow you to just make a show of this. This was not about being a part of the tour. Everybody gets baptized, That's
Everyone
part
gets
of the tour.
dunked and then on for lunch.
No, he was quite specific that this is a very meaningful undertaking, and And I remember him spending a considerable amount of time with each one of us. Now, there were like 40-odd people in this group. But out of the 40-odd people, there were, I'm going to say, 8 or 9 that maybe chose to be baptized. Yeah. And he was quite, he spent time with each and every one of us talking about our faith story, assuring himself that this was not just a part of the trip. This was a meaningful experience of demonstrating your love of Christ. And having had that experience, Shannon and I were both baptized in the Jordan River. And that will always be obviously a fond memory of Israel. But well beyond that, Israel was for me, I'm a geography buff. Right. I love travel. I love geography. I mean, places and things that happen in places are very meaningful to me. It's a part of what I enjoy reading and I enjoy being a part of. And now when I read the Bible, when you say the road to Damascus, I know the road to Damascus. Yeah. I may not have been on that very road, but I know Jerusalem. I know Jericho. I know Nazareth. We've been there. We've walked in places that I'm sure Christ walked. Yeah. So when I read the Bible, it becomes a part of geography, a part of history that I clearly understand, and I can place it all in my head, where before Israel, it was those are just words. Those are just, I know where they are on a map, but I can actually physically appreciate Jerusalem. I can actually physically appreciate the Mount of Olives overlooking Jerusalem. I can picture the Dead Sea, the Sea of Galilee. We were on the Sea of Galilee. We were in, Bethsaida and all of those small places where Jesus and the disciples performed miracles. We stood on the hill where they believed that Jesus fed the 5,000 just outside of Bethsaida, overlooking the headwaters of the Jordan River. All of those things make my understanding of the Bible so much more meaningful for me because of my love of geography.
Yeah. Oh, that's beautiful. And I actually think there's something extremely beautiful when you think of you walked where Jesus walked and you were baptized in the same water, the Jordan River where Jesus was baptized. And so there's just something beautiful there. Your celebration of being united with Christ where Christ also was. That's amazing. Thanks, Gary. I think most of you know that Gary serves as the board of our chair, or the chair of our board. the chair of our board. And I love how the experiences of your life have perfectly prepared you for this role. All who have the opportunity to serve with you recognize that perfectionist side of you that's well honed, but it keeps the team on task and productive and doing what needs to happen. It's actually really beautiful. You serve with excellence and competency. So from my heart, actually, thank you so much. Deep within, I have deep thanks and gratitude. But can you share maybe a highlight with us about just your board service time?
Well, board service for me is some will rightly understand it was a task that I was asked to take on. I was an attender. I was a behind-the-scenes attender at PFC for a long time. That's the way I wanted it to be. I valued the lessons. I valued the friendships, but I was not inclined to step forward until I was asked to take on a particular task. And I thought, well, if I can be of an assist in that regard, I will do that. I will spend a short time getting that undertaking behind us, and then step away. It wasn't quite that easy.
the particular ask was 1 year, right? 1 year.
Yeah, it was 1 year,
And-
and specifically 6 months to bring on a new pastor, Pastor John, and the result of some of my perfection right here.
You're a failure then.
But that was the ask, and we did that, and I wanted to be sure that John was able to step in and carry on, and he did that remarkably well, especially when we consider that in 3 months or 2.5 months after he arrives, we are shut down basically, or locked down. But John was asking about the highlights of the board. The first thing I have to find out when I arrive here is what this board is. What is the board, and what do they do, and why do they do it, and how do they do it? And that becomes a bit of a learning process while we're undertaking this very important work in searching for a new pastor. And that when I begin to understand the board, when I begin to understand the work of the board, the tasks that are required of board and board members, it's not a simple thing. There are a myriad of small, perhaps less important, but larger, more important issues that have to be dealt with. And they have to be dealt with expeditiously at times. And they have to be dealt with in a way that involves the team of which the pastor forms a part of, and the congregation. And all of that has to happen in a way that things keep moving appropriately, that things don't bog down, that things don't go awry. So I mean, there is an organizational aspect to the whole thing that I was, quite frankly, unaware of. Now, there are many that came before me, certainly, and some sitting in this very room, and they'll appreciate everything I say. But my first experiences with this board was, in my view, perhaps a misunderstanding of the way we are to conduct business here in Canada vis-a-vis the United States. We are a part of a denomination that's centered in the United States. And I think for the most part, they might look at us as just another church. But in fact, we are just another church, a part of their denomination, but very, very different. There's a land border that, with laws and requirements that are quite specific to Canada, that I don't believe, in my mind, the board had a real appreciation of. And one of my first experiences with the board was to deal with Canton, Ohio, and have them appreciate the unique aspects of the law as it relates to board governance in Canada. And that was not a difficult process, because I think they very quickly came to understand that, yes, there are some differences. And yes, maybe we don't do that quite the same in Canada as we do here. And some of those processes have been changing as we speak. John will speak to some of those things that are quite different, that I think Canton, Ohio now clearly understands. I believe that. But we are nonetheless a part of the denomination, but there are significant differences. And I think that's one of the highlights, John, that I felt was to draw an important line of distinction between them and us in some respects. And beyond that, of course, there are the highlights of accomplishments that we as a board team, in my view, have done remarkably well at moving quickly to address some of the outstanding matters, some of the issues that needed to be at least attended to and updated when it comes to policies and those kinds of things. So those are things that, again, those that came before, those that know the history of the church and the board will appreciate the comments that I make. But, I think we've done, in my view, quite a remarkable job in a short time in moving some issues forward that needed to be looked at.
This is the competency we were talking about earlier with regards to just bringing that experience and being able to do just such a great job. And I love how you highlighted that those years that you served as an attender, there were others that served behind the scenes, that were doing that board work, that were kind of plotting the course forward, doing some of that work, which is just, again, beautiful and amazing. And now, next man up, right? Next man up. And I'm just glad that they got the yes first before you understood all that it involved. Some of the other board members may appreciate that as well. But Gary, I just want to say thank you. Thanks for cracking your heart, your story, your journey, sharing with us. Yeah, there's a lot of beauty there, and I want to thank you for that. Let me just pray, and then we'll move on to just a final song. Gracious Father, we thank you for who you are. I want to thank you for Gary and how you've used him, how you've been involved in his life from his youngest days. I thank you for Mrs. McCready. I thank you for his grandparents. I thank you for his parents, all who helped form a foundation of faith. And I thank you that you brought him back, for Joyce Myers and for Rick Warren and for Margaret, who steadfastly, faithfully prayed for him as he went through. I thank you for his experiences in Israel. I thank you for Carolyn, who has joined his journey and now serve as our local power couple, just serving behind the scenes, helping to make sure things happen. So much that you've done in their lives to bring us to this day. And I want to thank you that you have woven Gary into the story that you're writing through this church family. It's in the name of Jesus we pray. Amen.